So there I was, Jake Rodriguez, sitting in the diplomatic lounge of the luxury cruise ship Harmony's Dream, wondering how exactly my life had gone so spectacularly off the rails. 3 years of xenological studies, 2 years of diplomatic training, and somehow I had ended up as the guy they send to deal with the galaxy's most terrifying apex predators when all the actual diplomats suddenly come down with a mysterious case of space flu. Funny how that works. The Zephyrian delegation had arrived that morning, and let me tell you, the brochures really don't do them justice. Imagine if a grizzly bear and a dire wolf had a baby, then fed that baby nothing but protein shakes and pure rage for about 15 years. That's a Zephyrian on a good day. They stand about 8 feet tall, have fur that looks like it was designed by someone who really hates the concept of cuddling, and teeth that could double as industrial cutting tools. But the real kicker? Their pack leader, Commander Thrakval, had a reputation that preceded him by about 3 star systems. This was a being who had reportedly stared down a Galactic Council mediator until the poor guy had literally fled the room crying. The same mediator who'd successfully negotiated peace between the Crystal Hive Mind and the Plasma Wraiths. Yeah, that guy. And now, here I was, sitting across from Thrakval in the ship's supposedly relaxing diplomatic suite, watching him examine me like I was a particularly disappointing appetizer. His pack of 5 subordinates flanked him, all of them radiating that special kind of barely contained violence that makes you really appreciate having exit strategies. "You are not what was promised," Thrakval rumbled, his voice carrying the subtle undertones of someone who's used to having his complaints resolved through creative applications of violence. "Where are the senior negotiators?" I cleared my throat, trying to project confidence I absolutely did not feel. "Ambassador Fletcher is recovering from a sudden illness, sir. As is Deputy Ambassador Morrison, and Assistant Deputy Ambassador Kim, and, well, pretty much everyone above my pay grade." One of Thrakval's subordinates, a slightly smaller killing machine I'd mentally nicknamed Fang No. 2, let out what I can only describe as a skeptical growl, the universal language of, "This human is about to become a cautionary tale." "So they send us a cub," Thrakval continued, leaning forward in a way that made every primitive part of my brain start screaming about predators and prey dynamics. "Tell me, small human, what exactly makes you qualified to speak for your species?" Now this was the moment where a proper diplomat would launch into their credentials, their training, their deep respect for Zephyrian culture and traditions. Instead, I found myself looking at this 8-foot-tall apex predator and thinking about how my life had become a cosmic joke. "Honestly," I said, immediately regretting the word choice, "mostly the fact that I'm the only one who didn't mysteriously develop symptoms the moment your ship docked. But hey, I've got a bachelor's degree in xenological studies and a really sincere desire not to become an interstellar incident." The silence that followed was the kind that makes you acutely aware of your own heartbeat. Thrakval's eyes, which were roughly the color of molten gold and about twice as warm, fixed on me with the intensity of someone trying to decide between quick death and slow death. "Interesting," he finally said, and somehow that single word carried more menace than most beings manage with entire threats. "We shall see how long you last, cub." What followed was basically a masterclass in how not to conduct interspecies diplomacy. I tried everything they'd taught us at the academy. The formal greeting protocols? Thrakval interpreted my respectful bow as a submission display and responded by literally growling at me until I stood back up. The cultural exchange of gifts? Apparently, offering a human peace lily to a carnivorous apex predator is like handing a vegetarian a steak and asking them to be friends. "Your species confuses weakness with courtesy," Thrakval observed after I'd attempted what the manual called appropriate deferent posturing. Behind him, his pack was making those rumbling sounds that either meant laughter or hunger, possibly both. By this point, word had gotten around the ship about the ongoing diplomatic disaster in Suite 7. I could practically hear the betting pools starting up in the observation lounges. The crystalline merchants were probably offering odds on whether I'd make it through lunch. The aquatic traders had likely already started a death pool. Speaking of lunch, that's where things really went sideways. The ship's head chef, bless his 3 hearts, had prepared what he assured me was a culturally appropriate meal for our Zephyrian guests. What arrived at our table looked like it had been hunted, killed, and served without any of those pesky intermediate steps like cooking or, stopping the twitching. "A proper meal," Thrakval announced with what I think was approval, grabbing one of the space rodent things and biting into it with obvious relish. Purple blood ran down his chin. "Your food preparers show wisdom." I stared at my plate, where something that looked suspiciously like it still had a functioning nervous system was attempting to crawl away from the garnish. This was definitely not covered in my diplomatic training. Wonderful, I managed, picking up what I hoped was a fork and not some kind of ceremonial torture device. Very fresh. The next 10 minutes were probably the longest of my life. Every attempt I made to eat the still-moving cuisine resulted in either the food escaping, me accidentally flinging it across the table, or my gag reflex staging a small rebellion. Meanwhile, Thrakval and his pack were watching me with the kind of fascination usually reserved for train wrecks or particularly amusing executions. "You do not hunt your food," Thrakval observed, not really a question. "Not recently," I admitted, chasing a particularly evasive piece of something around my plate. "We've kind of moved past the whole hunting thing as a species." This statement caused a ripple of what I can only describe as horrified fascination through the Zephyrin pack. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of a species that had apparently evolved beyond basic predatory instincts. "Then how do you prove your strength?" asked Fang Number 2, whose actual name I'd learned was Graxmore, but honestly, Fang Number 2 was easier to remember. "Well," I said, finally giving up on the moving lunch and setting down my fork, "we have performance reviews." Dead silence. "And tax season," I added helpfully. Even deader silence. Thrakval leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously under his bulk, and fixed me with a stare that made me feel like I was being evaluated for nutritional content. "You are not what I expected from the species that claims dominion over this sector," he said finally. "Your senior diplomats flee at our approach. You cannot consume proper prey. You speak of strange rituals I do not understand." The disappointment in his voice was almost worse than the earlier threats. "It's one thing to be considered a potential snack. It's another thing entirely to be considered a disappointing snack that's not even worth the effort." "Perhaps," Thrakval continued, his golden eyes narrowing, "we have overestimated humanity's worth as allies." And that, right there, was the moment I realized I wasn't just failing at diplomacy. I was potentially about to trigger an interstellar incident that would make the Proxima Centauri trade wars look like a minor disagreement over parking spaces. 6 hours later, I was sitting alone in my quarters, staring at the diplomatic incident report I was supposed to file. "How exactly do you explain to Galactic Command that you've managed to insult an entire species of apex predators by failing to eat lunch properly?" There's probably a form for that, but I'd never seen it in training. My stomach was making increasingly angry noises about the lack of actual food consumption that day. The space rodent cuisine hadn't exactly been an option, and I'd been too mortified to eat anything else in front of the Zephyrians after my spectacular dining failure. So I did what any reasonable human being would do when faced with cosmic-level embarrassment and an empty stomach. I wandered down to the ship's communal kitchen area and fired up the food synthesizer to make myself a grilled cheese sandwich. Look, I know how that sounds. Here I am, in the middle of the most important diplomatic mission of my thoroughly mediocre career, and I'm making comfort food like I'm some homesick college student. But sometimes you just need something familiar and warm and completely free of nervous systems. I was standing there, watching the synthesizer work its magic on some basic bread and processed cheese, muttering about diplomatic protocols and wondering if there were any openings in asteroid mining, when I heard the distinctive sound of claws on metal flooring behind me. Small human. I turned around to find Thrakval standing in the doorway, somehow managing to make even the ship's cheerfully lit kitchen feel like a predator's den. Great, just what my day needed. "Commander," I said, trying to sound like I hadn't just jumped about 3 feet in the air. "I was just getting some food." He approached with that fluid, predatory grace that made it very clear he could turn me into human-shaped confetti before I could blink, those golden eyes fixed on the synthesizer with obvious confusion. "You prepare prey alone?" he asked, tilting his massive head in a gesture that was almost curious. "Without your pack?" "Well, it's not really prey," I said, pulling the sandwich out of the machine. The smell of melted cheese and toasted bread filled the small space, and for a moment I felt almost human again. "It's just a sandwich." Thrakval moved closer, and I caught a whiff of that predator scent that had been making my hindbrain scream all day. But something was different. The aggressive tension from earlier seemed muted somehow. "This is food?" he asked, staring at my grilled cheese like it was some kind of alien artifact. I looked down at my sad little sandwich, then back up at 8 feet of apex predator, who probably considered my entire species nutritionally inadequate. "Yeah," I said, and maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the fact that I'd already screwed up so badly that it couldn't get worse, but I found myself tearing the sandwich in half. "Want some?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. Less, "I'm deciding how to kill you," and more, "I'm trying to understand what just happened." Thrakval stared at the offered half of sandwich like I'd just handed him a live grenade. "You Offer food to me, he said slowly. Without ceremony, without ritual combat? It's just a sandwich, man, I said, still holding out the half. I made too much anyway, which was a complete lie, obviously. It was one sandwich, but something about the way he was looking at it, with this mixture of confusion and what might have been curiosity, made me want to share it. Throckval reached out with one massive claw and delicately took the sandwich half. He examined it closely, sniffed it, and then, with the kind of caution you'd use when handling unexploded ordnance, took a small bite. The change in his expression was immediate and completely unexpected. Those predatory features softened, and for just a moment he looked less like a killing machine and more like, well, like someone who just tasted something that reminded him of home. This is, he paused, taking another bite. Warm. Yeah, I said, biting into my own half. That's kind of the point. Comfort food, you know? Makes you feel better when you're having a rough day. He finished the sandwich in 3 more careful bites, then stood there for a long moment, just staring at his empty claws. Comfort food, he repeated slowly, like he was testing the words. This is a human concept? Pretty universal, actually, I said. Most species have some version of it. Food that makes you feel safe or reminds you of good times or just makes things a little less terrible, you know? Throckval's golden eyes met mine, and for the first time since we'd met, I didn't feel like I was being evaluated as potential prey. Show me, he said quietly. How to make another. What followed was probably the weirdest cooking lesson in interstellar history. Picture this, me, standing next to a food synthesizer, trying to explain the finer points of bread-to-cheese ratios to an 8-foot-tall apex predator who could probably bench press a small spacecraft. The key, I said, programming the synthesizer for another round, is getting the bread golden but not burnt, and making sure the cheese melts all the way through. It's not about the ingredients, really. It's about the process. Throckval watched with the intensity of someone studying advanced weapons systems. And this brings comfort? Well, yeah, I said, pulling out the fresh sandwich and handing it to him. When I was a kid, my mom used to make these whenever I had a bad day at school. Scraped knee, failed test, whatever. There's something about the combination of warm, melted cheese and buttered bread that just makes everything feel a little more manageable. He took a bite, and again I saw that same softening around his eyes. My birth mother, he said slowly, would bring me heated fermented milk when the night terrors came. The other cubs mocked this weakness, but it made you feel better, I finished. Yes. The word came out almost surprised, like he'd never made that connection before. That's when things got really interesting, because apparently our little cooking session had attracted an audience. I looked up to see the rest of Throckval's pack standing in the doorway, all 5 of them watching their leader eat human comfort food with expressions that ranged from confusion to outright alarm. Commander, said Graxmore, the one I'd been calling Fag number 2. What are you consuming? Comfort food, Throckval replied, like this was a perfectly normal explanation. The human cub has shared pack wisdom. Now, I should probably mention that I had no idea what pack wisdom meant in Zephyrian culture, but judging by the way the other predators suddenly looked at me with something approaching respect instead of hunger, it was apparently a big deal. You would share this knowledge with the pack? Asked another one, a female whose name I'd learned was Kethara but who I'd been mentally calling Murder Claws. I looked at Throckval, who gave me what I think was an encouraging nod. Then back at the assembled group of beings who could turn me into human-flavored paste without breaking a sweat. Sure, I said, because apparently my survival instincts had completely given up at this point. Anyone want to learn how to make grilled cheese? The next hour was surreal in ways that I'm still not sure I can properly describe. Picture a cooking class where all your students are massive carnivorous predators, and the lesson plan involves explaining why processed cheese and white bread can be emotionally significant. It started with me making sandwiches for everyone, but it quickly evolved into something much deeper. As each of the Zephyrians tasted their first grilled cheese, something almost magical happened. The rigid pack hierarchy that had been so obvious before began to dissolve into something that looked almost familial. This reminds me of the warming stones my sire would heat during the cold seasons, said Vectar, the smallest of the group, who still stood about 7.5 feet tall. We would gather around them and share stories of the hunt. The taste is simple, added Kethara, but the feeling is complex. That's when Throckval did something that completely floored me. He started talking about his own childhood, about the comfort rituals his people had before they became the galaxy's most feared warriors. Apparently, young Zephyrians have something called comfort purring that they do when they're scared or hurt, and their parents respond with specific warming foods and protective behaviors. We are taught to abandon these weak customs when we join the warrior packs, he explained, finishing his second sandwich. Comfort is seen as a vulnerability that enemies can exploit. But that's insane, I said, and immediately wondered if calling an apex predator's cultural practices insane was going to be the thing that finally got me killed. Comfort isn't weakness. It's what keeps you functional when everything goes to hell. The pack exchanged glances, and I could practically see the mental gears turning. These weren't just mindless killing machines, I realized. They were people who'd been trained to suppress a fundamental part of their nature in service of being better warriors. Explain, Thrakvol commanded, but gently, like he actually wanted to understand rather than test me for weakness. So I did. I told them about human psychology, about how comfort foods and rituals aren't about weakness but about resilience, about how having something that grounds you and makes you feel safe actually makes you stronger in the long run, not weaker. I talked about how soldiers throughout human history have carried comfort items into battle, how emergency responders rely on familiar routines to stay functional during crises. Your species, said Graxmore thoughtfully, uses comfort as a tool for survival. Exactly, I said. We don't see it as giving up strength, we see it as maintaining strength over time. That's when Thrakvol stood up and I tensed, wondering if I'd finally gone too far. But instead of aggression, he moved to the food synthesizer and started programming it himself. I will make one for you, he announced. This is reciprocal comfort? Yeah, I said, watching this massive predator carefully monitor the bread browning process. That's exactly what it is. As I bit into the sandwich he'd made for me, which was honestly pretty decent for a first attempt, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The Zephyrens weren't looking at me like prey anymore. They weren't even looking at me like an inferior species. They were looking at me like pack. You have given us a gift, Thrakvol said solemnly, that we did not know we had lost. And in return, added Kethara, we name you Pack Friend. This is a title reserved for those who show wisdom and courage. I looked around at the group of apex predators who were now casually making grilled cheese sandwiches and sharing childhood memories, and wondered if this was what successful diplomacy was supposed to feel like. So, I said, does this mean we can skip the ritual combat part of your standard greeting protocols? The laughter that followed sounded nothing like the predatory rumbles from earlier. It sounded warm and genuine, and surprisingly human. For you, Jake, who shares calm comfort, Thrakvol said with what I was learning to recognize as his version of a smile, we will make an exception. News travels fast on a cruise ship, especially when it involves the galaxy's most feared predators suddenly acting like they've joined a cooking class. By the next morning, word of our impromptu sandwich ritual had spread through the Harmony's dream like wildfire, and I was discovering that accidentally becoming pack friend to the Zephyrians came with some unexpected side effects. The first sign something had changed was when I walked into the main dining hall for breakfast and half the ship went quiet. Not the scared quiet from before, but the curious quiet of people trying to figure out if they'd missed something important. Then, I saw why everyone was staring. Thrakvol and his entire pack were sitting at the largest table in the hall, and they'd saved me a seat, right at the head of the table, in what was clearly the position of honor. Jake who shares comfort, Thrakvol boomed across the dining hall, using that pack leader voice that could probably be heard 3 decks away. Your place awaits. Every conversation in the room stopped. I could feel dozens of species worth of eyes following me as I made my way over to the table, trying to project confidence I absolutely did not feel. This was not how I'd planned to start my day. Morning, everyone, I said, settling into my seat and trying to ignore the fact that I was now officially dining with the most dangerous beings on the ship. Sleep well? What followed was probably the most bizarre breakfast conversation in diplomatic history. The Zephyrians had apparently spent the night discussing human comfort food concepts, and they had questions. Graxmore wishes to understand the emotional significance of soup, Thrakvol announced, gesturing to his second-in-command. He believes it may relate to his people's ritual of sharing heated blood broth during grief ceremonies. I looked at Graxmore, who was watching me with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. Well, I said, soup is usually about nurturing, you know, taking care of someone when they're sick or sad or just need some comfort. It's liquid, so it's easy to digest when you're not feeling great, and it's warm, which is psychologically soothing. Graxmore nodded slowly. This aligns with our customs. The heated broth provides both nutrition and emotional comfort during times of loss. Exactly, I said, starting to get into the rhythm of this weird cultural exchange. Different ingredients, same basic concept. Comfort through nurturing. That's when I noticed we weren't alone anymore. A delegation of crystalline merchants had approached our table, their geometric forms catching the light as they moved. Behind them I could see representatives from at least 4 other species hovering nearby, clearly wanting to listen in but not quite brave enough to approach a table full of Zephyrians. Excuse the interruption, said the lead crystalline, their voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "But we could not help but overhear your discussion of comfort rituals. This is a fascinating concept that we had not considered in our previous cultural exchanges." Throckval looked at me, and I could see something that might have been amusement in those golden eyes. "The pack friend speaks wisdom that transcends individual species," he said formally. "Perhaps others would benefit from this knowledge." And that, right there, was how I accidentally became the ship's unofficial expert on interspecies comfort food diplomacy. Within 20 minutes, our table had grown to include representatives from 6 different species, all sharing stories about their own comfort traditions. The aquatic traders talked about the ritual significance of sea kelp broths during their spawning seasons. The silicon-based collective described their practice of sharing heated mineral compounds during their equivalent of childhood. Even the notoriously antisocial gas cloud entities had drifted over to contribute their experiences, with atmospheric pressure variations as comfort stimuli. "This is remarkable," said the crystalline leader, whose name was something like Prisonol but honestly sounded like someone dropping a chandelier downstairs. "We have been conducting formal diplomatic exchanges for cycles, focusing on trade agreements and territorial boundaries. But these comfort rituals, they speak to something much more fundamental. They speak to what makes us people," I said, surprising myself with how natural this all felt. "Doesn't matter if you're carbon-based or crystalline or made of pure energy. We all have things that make us feel safe and cared for." That's when things got really interesting, because apparently several of the species represented at our rapidly expanding breakfast gathering had been involved in minor territorial disputes that the senior diplomats had been failing to resolve for weeks. But when you get people talking about childhood comfort foods and family traditions, suddenly those abstract political disagreements start feeling a lot less important than the shared experience of being living beings who need nurturing. "Excuse me. Money is involved here. Keep 'em pushing. Are you going to tell me to call myself too "You know," said the aquatic trader representative, whose name was Bubblethis and who looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a disco ball. "Our spawning grounds dispute with the Silicon Collective seems rather petty when viewed through this lens of shared comfort needs." The collective's representative, a geometric arrangement of crystals that somehow managed to convey thoughtfulness, pulsed with agreement. "Indeed, perhaps we have been approaching this incorrectly. Instead of focusing on territorial exclusion, we should consider how both our species' comfort requirements could be accommodated." I watched in amazement as these two delegations, who'd been locked in formal negotiations for 3 weeks, suddenly started brainstorming collaborative solutions over grilled cheese sandwiches and stories about their respective childhood equivalent experiences. "This is unprecedented," said a voice behind me, and I turned to see Captain Martinez, the ship's commanding officer, approaching our table with an expression of barely contained bewilderment. "Mr. Rodriguez, I've been monitoring the diplomatic channels, and apparently 3 separate trade disputes have been resolved this morning. The other ambassadors are asking how you managed to accomplish in one breakfast what they've been failing to do for weeks." I looked around the table at the impromptu United Nations of comfort food that had somehow assembled around our conversation, then back at the captain. "Honestly, sir," I said, "I think I just stopped trying to be diplomatic and started trying to be human." Captain Martinez nodded slowly, like someone trying to process information that doesn't quite fit their understanding of how the universe works. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Command is very pleased with the progress." As the captain walked away, Thrakval leaned over and spoke quietly. "You realize what has happened here, pack friend?" "I've accidentally become good at my job," I suggested. "You have shown these beings that strength comes not from dominance but from vulnerability shared," he said. "This is true pack leadership, not the kind that commands through fear, but the kind that builds through understanding." I looked around the table again, watching a crystalline merchant teaching a gas cloud entity how to appreciate the concept of warm food, while an aquatic trader and a Silicon Collective member sketched out plans for shared territorial usage based on their respective comfort requirements. "So what you're saying," I said slowly, "is that I accidentally became a pack leader by making everyone grilled cheese sandwiches?" Throckval's expression was definitely a grin now. "Jake, who shares comfort," he said. "You have much to learn about the power you wield." Just then, my communicator chimed with an incoming message from Ambassador Fletcher. Apparently, he and the other senior diplomats had made a miraculous recovery from their space flu and were ready to resume their duties. I looked at the message, then at the table full of formerly hostile species who were now planning joint cultural exchanges and comfort food festivals, then back at the message. "You know what?" I said, deleting the message without responding. "I think they can wait a little longer. We're not done here yet." The rumble of agreement that went around the table sounded suspiciously like approval, and for the first time since boarding the Harmony's Dream, I felt like I might actually know what I was doing. 3 days later, I was standing in Captain Martinez's ready room, staring at a promotion document that I was pretty sure had to be some kind of clerical error. Senior Cultural Liaison, I read aloud, just to make sure the words were actually there. With full diplomatic authority and a salary increase of 40%. Congratulations, Mr. Rodriguez, Captain Martinez said, though he still had that expression of someone who wasn't entirely sure how any of this had happened. Command was very impressed with your innovative approach to interspecies relations. Innovative approach. Right. That was one way to describe accidentally starting a galactic comfort food movement, because that's essentially what had happened. Word of our breakfast gathering had spread beyond the Harmony's dream. Other ships in the sector had started requesting cultural exchange programs focused on comfort ritual sharing. The Galactic Diplomatic Corps had issued 3 separate requests for detailed reports on my revolutionary methodology. Apparently, resolving territorial disputes through grilled cheese sandwiches was being hailed as a breakthrough in peaceful conflict resolution. There's one more thing, Captain Martinez continued, reaching into his desk drawer. A gift from the Zephyrian delegation. He handed me a wrapped package that was surprisingly heavy for its size. I opened it carefully, aware that anything given by apex predators probably deserved some respect, and found myself holding what looked like a cross between a ceremonial dagger and a really fancy spatula. It's a comfort claw, came Thrakvol's voice from the doorway. I turned to see him ducking through the entrance, followed by the rest of his pack. A traditional tool used in the preparation of nurturing foods. It has been blessed by our eldest comfort keeper and inscribed with your pack name. I examined the blade more closely and saw that someone had indeed etched Jake who shares comforts along the flat of the metal in flowing Zephyrian script. This is incredible, I said, testing the weight of it. But I have to ask, Comfort Keeper, I thought you said your people had abandoned those traditions. Raxamore stepped forward, and I was surprised to see what looked suspiciously like embarrassment in his expression. That was not entirely accurate. We maintained the traditions in secret, practiced only in the deepest levels of our ships where the warrior leaders would not observe. The Comfort Keepers were our historians, our healers, our... He paused, searching for the right word. Therapists, Ketara supplied helpfully, though they would be insulted by such a simple translation. The point is, Thrakvol continued, you have given us permission to reclaim a part of ourselves that we thought was lost forever. For this, you will always be pack friend to the Zephyrian people. Captain Martinez was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made. If I may ask, he said, what exactly are your plans for implementing this new diplomatic approach fleet-wide? I looked at the comfort claw in my hands, then at the group of former apex predators who were now essentially my found family, then at the promotion papers that officially made me responsible for cultural relations across 3 sectors. Well, I said slowly, I figure we start with the basics. Food synthesizer training for all diplomatic staff, mandatory comfort food cultural exchange programs, maybe a regular sandwich summit where representatives can share their traditional nurturing practices without all the formal protocol getting in the way. You're serious, Captain Martinez said, and it wasn't really a question. Dead serious, I replied. Look, we've been approaching diplomacy like it's some kind of chess game, all strategy and positioning and careful moves. But that's not how people actually connect with each other. People connect through vulnerability, through sharing the things that make them feel safe and cared for, through admitting that sometimes even apex predators need a warm meal and someone who gives a damn. Jake, who shares comfort, speaks wisdom, Thrakvol rumbled approvingly. Perhaps other species would benefit from understanding this truth. That evening, the ship's head chef had agreed to let me take over the main kitchen for what was being billed as the first official comfort food cultural exchange dinner. Half the ship had signed up to attend, including several species that normally avoided large gatherings due to various cultural taboos or dietary restrictions. I stood at the central preparation station looking out at a dining hall filled with beings from dozens of different worlds, all gathered around tables where they were sharing stories and food and the kinds of small vulnerabilities that somehow make you feel less alone in the universe. The crystalline merchants had brought something called Harmony Resonance Powder that they sprinkled on heated mineral solutions during times of stress. The aquatic traders were teaching anyone willing to learn how to prepare sea kelp broth that apparently tasted like the safety of deep currents. The gas cloud entities had somehow managed to create a physical manifestation of their atmospheric comfort rituals that looked like edible lightning and tasted like the feeling of a perfect storm. And at the center of it all, Throckvol and his pack were serving grilled cheese sandwiches to anyone who wanted to try them, explaining the concept of shared comfort with the patient enthusiasm of people who'd rediscovered something precious they thought they'd lost forever. "You know," said a voice beside me, and I turned to see Ambassador Fletcher, looking somewhat sheepish. "When I heard about your methods, I have to admit I was skeptical." "Skeptical is one word for it," I replied, remembering his sudden recovery from space flu. "Terrified and hiding might be more accurate." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Yes, well, the Zephrins have quite a reputation. But watching this?" He gestured at the dining hall, where a Silicon Collective member was apparently learning to appreciate the concept of bread, while a gas cloud entity tried to explain the emotional significance of atmospheric pressure. "This is remarkable. You've accomplished something here that I'm not sure any of us understood was possible." "What's that?" "You've made diplomacy human," he said simply. "Not in the sense of being specifically about our species, but in the sense of being about what makes us all people, regardless of what we're made of or where we come from." I watched Kethara teaching a young crystalline how to flip a grilled cheese sandwich without breaking it, both of them laughing at the inevitable disasters that resulted from someone without fingers trying to use cooking utensils designed for someone with opposable thumbs. "You know what the crazy part is?" I said. "I still have no idea what I'm actually doing. I'm just treating everyone like they're people instead of political abstractions, and apparently that's revolutionary." "Sometimes," Ambassador Fletcher said thoughtfully, "the most revolutionary thing you can do is the most obvious thing that no one thought to try." Later that night, I was back in my quarters, trying to write a report that would somehow explain to Galactic Command how comfort food had become the foundation of a new diplomatic methodology, when my communicator chimed with an incoming priority message. It was from Admiral Chen, the head of the Diplomatic Corps, and it was brief. "Rodriguez, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. We're getting requests from 17 sectors for your cultural exchange program. Prepare for reassignment to the flagship. We're making this official. Well done." I leaned back in my chair, still holding the comfort claw that had somehow become both a ceremonial weapon and a kitchen utensil, and thought about the chain of events that had led me here. 3 days ago, I'd been a mid-level diplomatic attaché whose biggest achievement was not getting eaten by apex predators. Now I was apparently spearheading a galactic revolution based on the radical concept that sharing food and feelings might be more effective than formal negotiations and territorial posturing. The universe, I reflected, had a really weird sense of humor. My door chimed, and I looked up to see Throckvol standing in the entrance, holding what appeared to be 2 cups of some steaming liquid. "I brought you heated fermented milk," he said, offering me one of the cups. "My birth mother's recipe. I thought you might enjoy learning a Zephyrian comfort tradition." I accepted the cup, inhaling the rich, warm scent that somehow managed to smell like safety in childhood and the kind of love that doesn't need words. "You know what's funny?" I said, taking a sip of the surprisingly delicious drink. "When I was a kid, I used to dream about exploring the galaxy, meeting alien species, maybe making some kind of difference in the universe. I just never imagined I'd end up conquering the known galaxy through the strategic application of processed cheese and carbohydrates." Throckvol's rumbling laugh filled the small room. "Cheku shares comfort," he said. "You have not conquered anything. You have simply reminded us all that we are more alike than we are different. This is perhaps the greatest gift one being can give to another." I raised my cup in a toast. "To comfort food diplomacy, then. May it continue to confuse the hell out of everyone while somehow actually working." "To shared comfort," Throckvol agreed, clinking his cup against mine. "And to the human who taught an apex predator that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need a warm meal and a friend." Outside my viewport, the stars stretched out in all directions, full of possibilities and species I'd never met and problems I'd probably have to solve with some combination of food, empathy, and whatever wisdom I could manage to stumble into. But for the first time since I'd joined the Diplomatic Corps, I felt ready for whatever came next. After all, I had a comfort claw, a promotion I still didn't quite believe, and the backing of the galaxy's most feared predators, who'd decided I was worth keeping around. Plus, I was pretty sure the universe was going to keep being weird enough that my particular brand of accidental competence would continue to be useful. And if all else failed, I could always make more grilled cheese sandwiches.